Hi. Thank you for coming. I suppose in lots and lots of ways, this is some kind of a major watershed for Nalsar, that we are all sitting down here together and talking about issues which possibly are of concern to you on a day-to-day basis, and maybe have been a lot of gossip for us on a day-to-day basis. But the harder questions, the questions of, okay, I'm doing this, I'm doing it on my own, is it the right thing, not the right thing, what is the right way of going about it? The kinds of questions of, my family asked me to be on the straight and narrow, my friends want it otherwise, what am I supposed to do? And all of those sort of issues of that, yeah, I mean, I asked somebody out, it was all clear, it works, doesn't work. How do we worry about these questions of yes and no? And we are not sitting here to talk with you about the no's. As law students, I think you know all the various ways in which interaction is not permissible. We're going to worry about how do we do it? How do we understand yes? What is this ground level situation from where we would take off? And I have to say all these nice things in the beginning, and then I have got one of the most awesome happening panels. And you have each person here on the panel who's going to give you a different kind of take on this business of understanding yes. On this business of that if I want to be exploring myself, looking at the various kinds of life issues that come to me as a young person who wants to explore sexuality, acknowledge desire, how do I go about doing it? What's the right and wrong way of doing it? And it's that conversation that we're going to have today. This is not any kind of a targeting of anybody, neither man nor woman. We're all socially constituted. Don't know how many of us are more men than women. Forget about our biological identifications. And keeping all of that in mind, and just a friendly inaugural conversation, because unless and until we start talking about things, we start discussing, deliberating on them, we can't possibly work out what is it that worries us about it, what is it that we want to set right or not set right. And it's in that process that I'm going to begin this evening's proceedings by calling my colleague from Australia, Vijayan Nagarajan, who's been teaching corporate law to several of you. And our selling point for her was, oh, we have a corporate professor who's a feminist. And whoever said that feminism is only about women's rights and things like that. So over to you, Vijaya.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Amita. It's really a pleasure to be here. I think my notes are gone. Yeah, Amita said that I'm going to be speaking about what it means to say yes and what it means to say no. I'm going to be avoiding that question. But I'm going to be talking about institutional responses. It's wonderful to see you all here. It's such a great audience, and it's good to see that it's such an event that everyone is participating in and interested in. So it was many years ago that I was at university as a student, and you know how memories can play tricks. I remember it as this wonderful time. It was just always springtime. There was always some kind of fragrance, and there was jacaranda trees, and there were these beautiful boulevards and jokes. Lots of fun. There was, of course, the exams that seemed to come in a heap and torture everyone, and then we got over them and proceeded to have more fun. And it seemed to be this never-ending, beautiful time. But I suppose that shows how old I'm getting, because I've forgotten all the things we did during that time. It was a time to, I suppose, a bridge from childhood to adulthood. It was a time where we formulated our values. It was a time where we decided what posture we wanted to take on. it was a time where we experimented in many ways to decide what we want to be in the future. Criminal law, litigation, being just simple choices, but much more complex choices were also called upon and made. And we changed our minds as well. So I suppose thinking it's a never-ending springtime is really quite silly, and it goes to show it was a long time ago and senility is coming fast towards me. But more recently, the Stanford sexual assault case, which you would all be aware of, the victim impact statement that went viral, raised the concern that of many students all across the globe in universities. That feeling of sexual assault, sexual harassment, just feeling uncomfortable, not safe, is something that has been resonating everywhere, and certainly in Australia as well. It was quite recently that there was a complaint made by Australian students to the Human Rights Commission in Australia, saying that they were sexually harassed. And there was a study done which showed 25% of students had experienced some kind of harassment over their university life. Quite a tremendous figure. If it wasn't for the bravery of those students who came up, told their stories, told the truth, told about the challenges they faced, bared their soul, none of this would really have come to the fore. Activism among university students is necessary to bring any change. And part of activism is finding a group that can hear your story, can advocate for you, and speak loudly. And I know that in my short time, I've been here just for a bit more than a week, I know activism is alive, well, and growing in NALSA. It's great to see. And it's great to see that this issue is being debated. One of the things that the students at the University of Sydney wanted is they wanted their issue to be heard and taken on seriously. As a result, there was a survey that's underway now across, I think it's 36 universities in Australia. It's again coming out with the same statistics. 1 in 4 undergo some kind of dangerous situation, and the LGBTQ community face it even more. Even higher percentage have faced these issues. Now, the response from this group of activists has been to ask the institution to do something for them. They're calling for this institution that is teaching them many things, a learning institution, to also teach them some other things. Of course, an institution can't teach you everything, but Sydney University is developing a code of conduct at present, which is going to become the norm across universities across Australia. That code of conduct, this is where my corporate law background comes in, Amita. The code of conduct, however, can't really give effect to the code of behaviour that is individual, that each individual chooses. What choices they want to make, who they want to hang out with, all that can't be prescribed. But it is a step in the right direction to recognise a problem and to come together to at least set out some basic rules, some stepping stones pointing you in the right direction. However, codes of conduct can be totally useless instruments if they don't have participation from everyone. So participation by students has got to be involved, where they themselves are able to articulate what is acceptable behaviour and what is not. What is acceptable behaviour for me is certainly not for my daughters, as I'm reminded on a continuous basis. Sometimes they're so much more politically correct than me, but they're also much more adventurous in so many ways than me. So it's only by listening to them that I can decide what is appropriate for them and what is not. And all I can do as a parent, and what any institution can do, is help you articulate that. It cannot set it up for you. However, the other thing that has to be in a code of conduct besides this participatory element is, of course, there's got to be some kind of remediation or some kind of counselling facilities available, which guarantees you total anonymity. That kind of counselling is not trying to replicate the law. It's trying something completely different. It's trying to provide you with a safe space, and it's trying to perhaps offer you a chance to speak, and perhaps to speak on your behalf with whoever it is who might be the other party or parties who have caused you this problem and basically this trouble. The other thing I suppose that one should remember is the process. Staff as well as students have to be trained in how to go about accessing this process. I know that Sydney University is talking about a hotline, so that if you don't actually want to make a face-to-face complaint, you can make one completely with confidentiality. So that's something too that can be thought about. The other issue that's come up is it is not just an issue that belongs to any particular gender. We all seek to live together. We all seek to form relationships with one another. So it's an issue that has to be tackled by everybody. There's a recent case that happened which reassured me that institutions matter and institutions do have a role in helping you understand who you are and the kind of conduct you want to engage in and you want to encourage others to engage in. It's a recent case where a brash stockbroker tweeted about the appointment of a CFO to a company. ANZ was the bank, and a woman was being appointed as the CFO. Angus Atkin, who was working in a brokerage, tweeted that this was the dumbest appointment he had ever seen. A tweet, I suppose, you know, what does it matter? But it did matter, and I was really pleased to hear that it mattered. The staff, the head, the CEOs of all the banks gathered together and made a call, and he was fired. He tried all sorts of tricks, and he most probably will find a place elsewhere. But what does matter is that institutions can help you, and these institutions, workplaces too, can become allies in good behaviour, the creation of safe spaces, and an ethic for adulthood that we're all trying to learn about today. I might leave it there.
Okay. Thank you so much, Vijaya. One of the ground rules I forgot to speak about was that if you have a pressing question, then you can send it in writing to me here. If I think that it's something should be answered by the speaker straight off, I'll put it to her. Otherwise, we're going to do the Q&A at the end. And for the Q&A also, I would sort of encourage you to send your questions in writing. We have some in with us from the earlier surveys, especially done with the first and second years. But we are much more wanting to have conversations. You're encouraged to, but just so that we maximally use the time. So where has Vijaya started us out from the fact of that, all right, as institutions, what is it that we can be doing to create the safe spaces for the kind of discourse we want? The further kind of question, especially I suppose in the context of a law school, is that, all right, are these conversations necessarily to be about creating codes, participative, having remedial measures and whatever? And would these codes, essential as they are, how much of our anxieties and questions can they really answer? So the next speaker, Archana Parashar, who's kind of teaching the Gender and Law course here at the moment, or the Gendering Legal Education course, sorry, who sort of takes us further on this particular angle of this whole issue. Archana, you can switch on that button.
Thank you, Amita. And what I'm going to say to all of you first is, it's nice to see so many people here. It's very encouraging that this is an issue that you want to start a conversation on. And I think the emphasis that I want to put on it is that it is a conversation. And basically what we are talking about is young people like you exploring your sexuality, exploring your identities as active sexual agents. But we also are part of a society where this is not the done thing. So we have to acknowledge that we are dealing with an issue that is just beginning to become even accepted that it is an issue, and for it to become a topic of public conversation, I think all of us have to bring in a lot of goodwill to the process. Now, what is my take on the issue as a law teacher, sitting with law school people, with your teachers and with law students? It's very easy for me to say, this is what the law has got to say on the topic. So basically, we are kind of trained, we have forgotten that there's another way of being except going to the law for the answers. Now, it is a little bit challenging for me as a law teacher to tell you that law doesn't really matter. Your Vice Chancellor sitting here, he'll probably not invite me again, but never mind. Basically, what I want to say is that we have to think outside the box a little bit. So what does consent mean? As the title of the panel says, it's not talking about when is a no a no. So the title of the panel is a considered title, in that as lawyers, we are trained to say, don't do that, you're not allowed to do that, that is prohibited, etc. Law doesn't tell us what I can do or what you can do or what is permissible, in the sense that what is not prohibited might be permissible, but I don't really know. And this is the point I think I want to make today, is like Vijaya explained to you that an institutional response is important, and there are ways of formulating that response that can be a collective response. That is absolutely true, but what I want to ask you is, where do you stand in that, other than being part of an institution? That is, as individuals, as young people, as people who are exploring your identity and developing your ideas and values, what you think about sexual relationships, whether what you think is acceptable or not acceptable, or is there a sounding board where I can actually test out my ideas? Is there a place for that in your life? In other words, it's very easy to polarize ourselves and say us and them, and us is always right and them is always wrong, whichever side of us and them we are on. I'm putting out this idea to you that putting so much emphasis on getting the law to give you the answers is a misplaced confidence. That is, law is important. law sets norms. And you could also say that in this regard, in regard to sexual assault, criminal law in India has actually taken a very radical stand. Your 2013 amendments to the definition of sexual assault, etc., have come about because of a particularly sad incident. But does changing the law change very much? So can we now sit on our laurels and say that basically we have done what could be done? It was, we had to confront the fact that sexual assault happens in our society to a very horrible degree, and we have made a change. I would suggest we need to think about that very carefully, and remember that law is not only legislation, it is also how it is interpreted. And it is not only what we do in the courts, it's also that we never get to the court, yet law kind of directs our conduct, etc. But can the law give you the final answers in absolutely every situation? When I am in a situation of a sexual relationship and I'm not sure of where I stand, there's no law book, there's no law professor who's going to help me. In that situation, where do I find the resources to respond in a humane manner, in a respectful manner, in a manner that doesn't victimize me and doesn't victimize the other person? So for that reason, what I'm suggesting is how we behave is up to us in the first instance. What effect that has on the law, possibly it will have a real effect, but let's leave that for the time being. So even contrary to my professional identity, I'm suggesting to you that this is an issue that we need to confront as individuals. That is, instead of talking about what kind of enforcement of the rules is possible, I'm saying to you, maybe we need to start asking that what is at issue is that we are living in a society where norms of sexual conduct are in transition. So on the one hand, I was speaking to Jugal, who's on the panel, and he said 10 years ago when I was at the university, issues of sexual conduct were non-issues. Not that people weren't engaging in sexual conduct, but that was not an openly accepted idea. So think about it, that in 10 years' time, we have come such a long way. That is, young people engage in sex is not a new discovery. But as a society, we do not acknowledge it. The fact that we do not acknowledge it doesn't mean that it goes away. But for young people like you, the added tension is that on the one hand, the so-called social mores tell me one kind of conduct is proper, and I have the possibility that I may want to test the limits and want to engage in activities which may not have been acceptable to my parents or to my wider society. What is my role in this situation? Where do I go to find the guidance as to what is acceptable or not acceptable? I would suggest that no amount of looking elsewhere is going to help. So as very privileged members of this society, as people who are going to be the leaders of tomorrow, who are going to run this society, don't you think that it is I don't know, I'm suggesting to you is that you have to take the ownership of the issue. That is, instead of looking for others enforcing certain modes of conduct, it is for us as a group, as young adults as people who are capable of public that All right, so what I'm suggesting is that basically then acknowledging that this is a gray area where I don't know what the proper behavior of modes of conduct might be, maybe it is time for us to make it possible that we start an open conversation, a respectful conversation where we can discuss without threat and without being targeted, that maybe what do other people think? If I don't agree with somebody else's view, there is a possibility of entering into a dialogue and saying, well, I want to tell you that there's another way of thinking, or I'm willing to listen that what you have to say, and maybe that will make me rethink my position. And in that sense, rather than it being something that is imposed on us from the outside, we become the authors of how we think codes of conduct or more codes of behavior can be generated, so that we treat each other respectfully and we treat each other humanely, rather than always either on the defensive or accusing. So that we acknowledge that we are uncertain, but uncertainties happen in various areas of life. We don't go to the police, we don't go to the law to resolve our doubts about what is the proper thing to do in this regard. And in that sense, what I'm suggesting is, and this is where my being a law teacher comes back again, is that you start thinking of law not as something that is imposed upon you, but that is something that you are engaged in generating. That is, you generate the mores of what is proper behavior, what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And the fact that you are the authors of these ideas then makes it that much more easy for us to live by that. And if we find it difficult, we find ways of revising those ideas, rather than expecting that our institution or our teachers or our legal system can provide us the final answers. Of course, all of them have a role to play, but my single message is that how we behave or how we live our lives is that we acknowledge the immense amount of privilege that we have and use it responsibly, so that we are participating in creating how the society that we're going to be part of will look like. So in that sense, your distance between law and people also, it's another way of looking at what the law is, and it can be that you are the opinion makers of tomorrow, and you work with ideas that how opinions are generated and accepted or not accepted is a collective activity rather than something that is imposed from above. I'll stop here for now.
So participation seems to become the kind of, you could say, the key value. Vijaya emphasized on it, and Archana in a different kind of way. Those of you who are attending her course would be aware of the fact that she has this very foundational way of questioning the law, especially positivist law, which she sort of says that this business of neutrality and objectivity is a farce. You put it out to hide behind, to put out this question of neutrality, to put your prejudices behind them. The sort of thing that we are worrying with is somewhere that, all right, it's good to know that we can do it ourselves. It is good to know that we can talk about it. But talk about what? We're all kind of unsure, we're confused, we don't know what's the right thing. We're possibly, a lot of people have been saying in the survey that we conducted that, oh, this is a male targeting exercise. This is out to incriminate the men. How do I know what is implied and real consent? Is there no such thing as implied consent? So the one man on the panel is going to sort of perform this Herculean task of talking about, because Hercules, is going to perform this Herculean task of telling us.
I accuse this of patriarchy.
Absolutely. So come on, let the feminists speak. So Jugal Modi, who's going to speak to us about some of the confusions that all of you are confronted with, some of the ways in which he has dealt with them, and
Okay. Firstly, one of the important things to look at is it's not binary in the sense that there's no yes, there's no switch that says, a partner, a sexual partner doesn't come with a switch that says, green light blinking, touch me. Red light blinking, don't touch me. No, it's not that simple. It's a lot more complicated than that. So more than asking that what is a yes, you should be looking at what all me comprises. It's like a giant set of things that happen together when you and your partner are hanging out. And all of those things, when they happen together, are both of you in the mood, and that is a yes. Coming back to something that has been addressed overall is that there's a certain sense of entitlement that men walk in with in a relationship. Women sometimes comply, sometimes they don't comply, things then spiral out. So that kind of, I would accuse that, like, I would technically call that toxic masculinity. I'm sorry, I'm a little spiraling at this point after the introduction because, so this affects the men as well in a very, so if we go by the standard applied rules, it doesn't help men at all, because if women are to approach men and men don't want to have sex, then what do you do about that? Most men accuse you of not being man enough at that point. In terms of the first thing is to start looking at is not look at rejection as the end of the world in any scenario. I'm out of words. So what you need to start looking at is look at sex outside of the boundaries of intercourse. Sex is not just something that you do when a man and woman's body collision. It's not a body collision course. It's a lot more than that. You go out on a date, you get to know the other person better, you need to talk about what you like, what you don't like. People spend hours talking about their favorite movie and then expect you, "Arey, we get along so well, we should just jump into bed." Like, no, if you spend hours talking about a favorite movie and realizing how much the two of you are compatible and the fact that the two of you want to have sex, spend 15 minutes talking about what you both like about having sex. Like, how you like to be touched, what are your good things, what are the things that work for you, what are the things that don't work for you. Okay, you might miss the moment in this process, but then do you really want to get intimate with someone who is not even willing to respect that basic conversation with you? So, yeah, that mostly sums up my entire thing is that, sorry. So that mostly comes to the whole thing is that one, we need to talk a lot about it. The whole idea is that people, growing up in my relationships and various other things, one thing that I've learned over a period of time is talk about it. Like, talk about sex, talk about physical love, talk about what you like, what you don't like. That's equally a part of your life as much as all the other interests that you share with the person who you're going to share one night with, 15 minutes with, a bathroom stall with, anything. So, yeah, keep a lot of these things in mind in terms of this. Men mostly need to do one important thing in this process is, don't forget, like in case of straight partnership, when you're looking at women, is that women at any given point, where if you both are equals, then they are living in more psychogeographical spaces than you are. At on a date, a woman is probably looking at 5 other things that are happening around them, around her. Is her skirt riding up? Is somebody else latching at her? There are various other parameters that also come into play. With me being a man, I know that it's like things are not as complicated. I'm just going to walk in. So when you are going to expect the other person to take charge of sorts, don't be afraid to take the onus of starting the conversation as opposed to just waiting for a flower to bloom, because then you are no different than the Bollywood movie that you all hate. Because the flower is going to bloom between the both of you. There's a conversation that needs to be had. And that mostly it ends with, that's where I'd like to stop talking at this point, because the only thing that I would like to encourage between any two kind of partners who want to get intimate with each other is talk about it. It's not a bad thing. Talk about what you like, what you don't like. Make a list probably. In fact, because everybody has weird sexual preferences at times. You can make a list and share it, and you can both email it to each other and then look at it separately to understand each other better. There are many ways to go about this, to just cut through the entire drama of what will happen if I touch her right now. No. So, anyways, that's where I'll end. Thank you.
Okay. So primarily what Jugal is asking us to sort of, it's in this, see, it's like when issues are taboos, when it's difficult to talk about them, when you start to talk about them, to get a script together itself becomes a really kind of an awesome exercise. To start to, primarily what one is saying is this, that all right, if the sexual interaction is an interaction you want to have, then some level of verbalizing and some level of working out in your own head, what is it that bothers you and what is it that attracts you. It's an acknowledgement of both desire and aversion. It's an acknowledgement of the fact that you like to do certain things and don't like to do others. It's about the fact of that, yes, this is, and primarily what one is trying to say is this, that either is okay. Be your own person and proceed from there. If I have to in core sum up what Jugal has said to us, he's saying, sort it out. It's not a big deal. It can be talked through. We don't have to make it such a big issue. And from that conversation, possibly a certain level of resolution is bound to come. I think it's like, see, the very fact that we are all in our tentative sort of ways opening up the issue is demonstrating to each of us on both this side and that side of the divide as to like how very new it is for all of us to verbalize these matters. So considering we are all finding it difficult to verbalize, I turn to the Queen and and of course, like, I suppose those of you who haven't seen Agents of Ishq, haven't been to the site, I strongly recommend. And if you've not been reading Paramita's midday columns, then you're really missing something in life. So Paramita Vora, faculty with us, the one expert on the panel, I would say.
Thank you. I think it's kind of amazing that this panel is happening. And I think the most amazing, for me, the most uplifting thing about it is that it is about saying yes. What does yes mean? Because, now it's become like so quick to say no means no. And we don't even know what no means, but yes, we know that no means you can't do a whole bunch of things. If you're saying yes, then what is it about? And it really leads us to the question, what does sex mean? What does sex mean to us? We don't talk about this. But we know that the truth is we've all grown up thinking sex is kind of dodgy. at best, you know. I mean, we all have also learned the politically correct things to say sex is just another emotion, sex is just this, but we don't think of sex as just anything. We think of it as an exception to every rule and to be treated as something very sacred, very sacrosanct, and if we can't make it sacred, then we make it meaningless. It's just a hookup. It doesn't mean anything, but everything means something. So the question really is, how can we have many meanings of sex? And in different ways, everybody on the panel has really spoken about that. So I'm a filmmaker and a writer, so I don't have erudite things to say, but I have some practical things to say. I think that many of us, all of us, I mean, as a young person, I did it, and I think until most of your life, you struggle with this. We think that sex determines our value as people. We believe that if we're not found sexually attractive, then somehow there's something lesser about us. And we struggle with this a lot. Earlier, your attractiveness was judged by how many people wanted to marry you. Now it's not like that. So now it's judged by how many matches you get, how many people give you attention, how important you are sexually in your own peer group, you know. So it makes sex into a matter only of power, not into a matter of love or enjoyment at all. And that's something we struggle with, and that's power we try to have. It's not just a power other people have. And that's something important to take ownership of, that I want to be sexually powerful, and I always want to be the one in the position to say no. Right? So the thing is, what's going to happen to the person who says yes? Because the first person to raise the issue is the one who's saying yes, right? And sometimes the other person says no just to have power. Then what do you do? So these are all the questions that we struggle with in our minds. And somewhere we find it easier to fall back on the idea that something else will give sex meaning. So an institution will give sex meaning. A long-term commitment means I respect you. If I'm not making a commitment to you, then I don't respect you. And actually, if somebody else doesn't respect me, that means I'm not worthy of respect. If somebody is not attracted to me, oh my God, it means I am not attractive. These are the hidden thoughts that we all travel with. And these are the hidden thoughts which make us play power games with each other instead of being able to speak openly to each other about sex. And in essence, it means what Archana said, that we go through as split people. On the surface, we're all talking about sex being casual, about hooking up and moving on, about not really caring, but deep inside we care, we feel disrespected, we feel devalued, and then because we do that, we try to devalue others, right? So I think there's a few ways out of this. I really believe there are a few ways out of this. And the first thing is to ask yourself, before you can even start talking to other people, what does sex mean to me? What is sex? Have you ever asked yourself that question? What is sex? Who's asked themselves this question? One hand. Actually, we don't ask. We assume that whatever everybody told us sex is sex. And everybody is always parents, society, pornography. Maybe very little. If you're really a very earnest and politically correct person, you've gone and found some feminist porn or some like high-class erotica, and then some people who say even poetry is sexual. All that is okay, but we know where the majority of our opinions are coming from, so we are struggling with those things. So I say the first thing everybody should do when they go back to their rooms tonight is ask yourself, what are the first 5 words I think of when I think about sex? Start asking yourself about your personal relationship with sex. Ask yourself if you give it too much of false importance. Are you giving it the right kind of importance? Is it becoming something in your life that's enabling, that's beautiful, that is something? Is autonomy just about having sex, or is it about having the right kind of sex? Is autonomy about being like a sex machine, or is it about saying, what's my sexual journey? Maybe my sexual journey is to have sex once in 3 years, and that's plenty for me. You know, like Leonard Cohen, who is a singer who is supposed to be the god of sex, always said that he can't have long relationships because sex is so intense and it creates such a creative upheaval in him that once in a while was just fine for him. And you know what? It was just fine for Leonard Cohen, it can be fine for a lot of people. So I think that journey, and that for Leonard Cohen, the art of creating and generating that sexiness to other people was a kind of sex, I suppose. So you may find that for each of us, there's a different type of sexualness that we are comfortable with. And when we are comfortable with it in ourselves, I think we can start imagining other people as sexual beings whom we can respect, right? So that, I feel, it's a practical suggestion. Please do it, and please start figuring out what you like for yourself. The other thing is, and this is something we've been doing on Agents of Ishq a lot, And I think a lot about love and sex, both for my work and for my own life, because I think it's in that who we are also gets expressed very outside law, outside society, outside norms, who we are as individuals. So I think that, yes, we don't have any codes. We don't know how to behave with each other. So we are using American dating technologies to decide for us what's cool. But we are us. We all come from very different backgrounds, and so all this American terminology to decide who is a dog and who is a cow and who looks like what, it's not helping us, right? It's not helping us move forward and have fun and love and pleasure in our lives. So I think we need to start creating sexual etiquette. We have to think about sex like we think about friendship and other people, and what is good manners. So we did a conversation on Twitter at Agents of Ishq asking people, what are the questions about sexual etiquette that they have? And people ask diverse questions from, is it good manners to reciprocate oral sex? To, if somebody comes to a place for the first time and has sex, is it good manners to ask them to stay the night? And somebody responded to this question in the most beautiful way possible by saying, a good host always offers, a good guest never assumes. And I thought that is really simple. So actually, if you use the rules of good manners and good etiquette to think about how you behave with sex, that will go a long way in solving many problems. It's a simple solution. The reason why we don't do it is because we think sex is an exception, and everyday rules don't apply to sex. But everyday rules apply to sex because they apply to people. I also think that the way we think about friendship is very helpful to us if we start thinking about sexual relationships in the same way, for two reasons. One is, in friendships we have disappointments. In friendships, sometimes we are rejected by our friends and we get over it, right? We go past it. And not everybody you want to be friends with wants to be friends with you. Sometimes your friends do really unforgivable things to you, but you bear it because there are other reasons why you think it's okay. Sometimes in friendships we identify patterns of abuse that happen between friends and we decide it's not cool for me. It's not ye dosti hum nahi todenge, I'm todoing it because I'm just being used, you know, whatever, as the fat girl to make my thin friend look good, or whatever else it is that your friend is doing to you, that's unfair. But if there is a step-by-step way in which we negotiate friendships, right? And in the same way that what do you like sexually or don't like sexually, we have that conversation with our friends every day. We ask, what do you want to go and eat? What would you like to do? Sometimes we do something our friend wants and we don't want, but we don't see this as an operation, unless it is a pattern. So I think that separation also can be made, that the first thing that happens is not the whole thing of sexual encounters. So let's break it up and take that consent bit by bit as we take with friendship. Let's take the intimacy bit by bit too, as we do with friendship. On the first day you meet somebody, as Amita was saying earlier, we go through an aap to tum to tu phase, no? Slowly in friendship. So it can be with intimacy also, there is no rush to be informal and behave badly. We behave badly after we've set up a big precedent of behaving well and then earn the right to behave badly and be forgiven once in a while, not as a practice, of course. Another thing is, I think, breaking up in interaction into steps. And I mean that not just in terms of intimate interaction, but rejection as well. So one of the things that happens is guys will message you on Facebook or wherever, WhatsApp, unknown people, and despite my age and stage, men do it to me also. And I hear a lot of people say, "Chi, how dare he? What does he mean?" But actually, so what? I really want to ask that question. Somebody you don't know sent you an unsolicited message saying, "Hey, I think you're hot." I don't think that makes them a creep. I think it's okay to say, "Thank you, but I'm not interested. Please don't message me again." You have good taste, yeah. Because, if you really ask yourself, the chances are that if he's cute, you might reply, and if he's not, you don't. Yes. Good is subjective. Jugal, who is always our conscience is telling us. But I think it's okay to say thank you and please don't message me again, because I don't really want to have this conversation. I've done it. I always do it. and 80% or maybe even 90% of the time it works. 10% of the time somebody is persistent, and that's harassment. And then I tell them, if you message me one more time, I will consider it harassment and I will report you to the police. Then they always keep quiet, although I'm not going to report them to the police. But I'm just saying, let your first position be good manners. It doesn't hurt. And let your second position be something else, and let your third position be like, fuck you. But don't let your first position be fuck you, Why? I mean, as in when you have sex, so in when you tell people off, you can take it bit by bit. And I think I follow the idea that let there not be violence. Let's not do violence to others, just like we don't want violence done to ourselves. So when you reject somebody, telling somebody you don't want to be with them is an art as much as telling somebody you want to be with them, right? So when you tell somebody you don't want to be with them, what is the kindest way you can do it in a way that never says, just because I don't want to be with you doesn't mean you're not worth being with. Let's not contribute to that in any way, because we all know how shitty it feels when somebody makes us feel like that. So I mean, at the risk of sounding really old-fashioned, it's very much a do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And it really works, because even for you, it de-escalates the situation. You just feel a lot less stressed out about, oh my God, what am I supposed to do? And actually, when somebody treats you lovingly in that way, it's still disappointing. You still feel bad, and you can go to your friend and crib about it. But the fact that they've done it kindly and nicely helps you to get past it. Lastly, life is long, and you think that the first time something happens to you is the last time it's going to happen to you, and you think sex is such a rare commodity, you won't have more of it, but you will. Hopefully you'll have a lot of it, because hopefully you will think it's such a nice thing to share. You'll have a lot of it on your own terms. So there should not be panic in the face of sex, as in, I won't get this, I'm not good enough, so this is my one and only chance. You are as good enough as you want to be, and as you treat other people. So, but first, I'm going to end now, instead of going on and talking as I do. But promise me that you'll go home and you'll write down this. What are the first 5 words I think of when I think about sex? And I know that it'll open up kind of a great conversation for you internally, which will help you have conversations with other people. Thank you.
So, I was right, no? The Queen speaks. and it's like what Paramita has of course brought out for us is this, that it's no big deal, it's no really big different thing. Okay. I've got my first question. As the notion of true love comes into being, which was based on respect, compassion, and empathy, has faded somewhere, my question is here, we've gone too far among and between ourselves, basing everything on individual notions, that we have forgotten those values that need to be respected while thinking of each other. The question is for anybody who wants to answer on the panel. Well, I suppose the concern is that there are, in this whole business of individual desire or individual sense of wrong, we have forgotten the values of caring for each other. So I suppose maybe every member on the panel can say something, and you can keep sending in your questions. We can also have colleagues from in the audience who would hopefully want to raise issues, but I thought firstly we'll begin this way. Now I was also negotiating the handwriting, so it was busy. Yeah.
So I'll go. Have we stopped caring for each other? Is that what the question is? I hope not. And what I was trying to say, and I think most people are trying to say, is that caring and having a sexual identity should go hand in hand. So a lot of the issues arise because we seem to think of sex as something that is not quite kosher, And that's why we behave not well enough, and that is Paramita's point also, that if we remember to be kind to each other, nice to each other, keep our communication channels open, then it is possible for me to respect the other person, but also expect that they will respect me. So nothing happens in a relationship if you don't treat the other person as an equally worthy human being, and whether it is a sexual relationship or an asexual relationship, a relationship does not happen if you don't respect the other person. And so I'm not sure where the question is coming from. If the question is that we are only talking about the sexual aspect of a relationship, well, that is because that's something that doesn't get talked about. And this is sort of our effort at trying to open up public spaces where we are saying that it is for you to start those conversations and to make it possible that we can talk about having a sexual identity without it being a matter of embarrassment or a matter of that how will I talk about it.
Thank you, Archana. I think the question is asking about individual motives and forgetting values that need to be expected while thinking of each other. Thank you. I just wanted to refresh my memory. I suppose one has to consider two things here. The first is the most fruitful relationships are ones where you are held to be important and precious, and as precious as the other person or persons with whom you're involved. Only with that confidence does there come an ability to be free, to be yourself, and to grow. So thinking of the other person seems essential to have a fruitful relationship. However, to catch up with another point that was made earlier, life is long, and you come across relationships which perhaps where you're not valued as much, perhaps where you're not the center, and perhaps where you're just blown away by the utter charm, intelligence, charisma of somebody else. Getting over that is, I think, important. And doing that, being able to do that shows some respect of yourself. It isn't an easy thing to develop, but it's to learn that with that rejection, with that hardship, with that ability to realize, well, you just stuffed up and you made a bad move and you were not treated all that well, with that comes a lot of strength. One thing's for sure, you won't do it again. And you'll become a much more stronger person, and you'll remember that hopefully with a bit of humor about something you've gone through that's made you more interesting and, you know, much more, got a good story to tell. So yes, I agree. It's a matter of thinking of a lot of people, but also not to worry too much if you're in a relationship which perhaps isn't as responsive as you'd like, because there's plenty of fish in the sea.
I think sis,
You can say something.
Yeah, sure.
That does work. I'm going to pass on this, sorry.
So I'll answer all the questions that have been given to me as homework together. So I do think that, I do understand what this question is trying to ask. Have we gone so far being individualistic that we forget about love as an idea and caring for each other? And I think a little bit we have, actually. I think that that's not the first thing we think about. And it's to kind of reduce the meaning of love to sacrifice. And so if you're going to sacrifice something for somebody, then that's love, but that's not love. That's just sacrifice. And on the other hand, when we're talking about individuality, we're only talking about selfishness, which is not the same thing as individuality. So we are scared to love each other. I feel that's the truth. And the way to get out of it is to not be scared to love somebody. Because everybody thinks, yeah, I want to be the first one to say no. I don't want somebody to say no to me. It's all down to rejection. And we have changed all the rules to be like win, 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 win. Everything can't be about winning. Some of the things some things you get, some things you don't get. And one has to relax about that in general. And that's the only way to be more loving to other people. There are phases in life, I think, when we protect ourselves more when things are tough. But that can go to the other extreme. I also feel, I don't know how it is for you guys, but I think having friends is very important if one wants to be able to find love. Because friends help you to love yourself. Because friends just love you. And friends are not so scared to love you. And that friendship allows you to find a kind of vocabulary of love. Somebody wants to know, how do you initiate a conversation about sex in a world where people brand you as a creep for doing so? I don't know if everybody will brand you as a creep for talking about sex. Let me tell you that my colleagues always tell me, you don't live in the real world because you think talking about everything is normal. Like, I will normally say that, do people remove their pubic hair on the internet? And people will get upset with me, and I'll be like, I don't know why he's getting upset. I'm just talking about body hair, right? So the thing is, yeah, people get alarmed if you talk about sex, but if you want to talk to a specific person about sex, here's a good test on how to do it. Imagine that, I don't know if this is a woman or a man who's asked the question. I don't know if this question has been asked by a woman or a man, but imagine that your really close friend or your cousin or somebody is being asked those questions. Will you think that it's creepy? If you do, then maybe you should think about whether you are creepy or not, right? So it's also sometimes a way of asking the question, whom you ask the question to, and what question you ask. But yeah, it's hard to control. People are prudish. People are prudish. Having an open conversation about sex is a little bit tough. So I would say you should test the waters. Go slow, no? See if the person is okay with talking about sex or not. If they're not okay with talking about sex, you can't force them until the moment has come when you're talking about having sex with each other. Otherwise, you gotta wait. You gotta wait and see. Sorry, no easy ones there. But I acknowledge that I think people are quick to brand people who want to talk about sex as cheap, creepy, loose, whatever are the cool new words for the same old slut shaming that has always existed, you know. Why does the burden lie on the consent seeker? Why do we only talk about it where women are the victims? I mean, I think there's a historical context, right, where there's a patriarchal context. Like for all the conversation that we're having, let's also acknowledge what Jugal said, right? There's a larger patriarchal context in which we all exist, in which women have not always had the agency or mobility or ability to speak about sex or act on their sexual desires without many more meanings being put on it than are put on men. So I think it's also fair to be a little extra empathetic to what stuff women are bringing to the table. And if as a guy you're not willing to do that, you're a big baby. You know, really, that's what you are. Because you're like, come on, yeah, guys also have their problems. Yeah, guys have their problems, but guys have slightly less problems than women have in this respect. Come on, get with that program, deal with it and move on. Don't make it such a big deal. Like, think of your grandfather and how polite he was to women and take a little page out of that book. No, so equality is not about being a big baby. Equality is about growing up and saying, I acknowledge that somebody of a different gender or a different caste has had a socially harder time than me. And it so happens that I have a certain amount of privilege, so I am going to be conscious of it. But yes, also we don't want to be trapped in that role forever, that women are always victims and men are always predators. But I think that if you can do that first position, that I'm going to acknowledge that you have some issues that you're coming with us just by being a woman, then evolving consent together will be a little bit easier. If you're not going to take that position, then what are you saying? You're saying men should make the first move, women should not, or the big baby men who are like, you know, feminists are like destroying the world, you know, and all the laws are for women. If you're being that big baby, then basically you're going to say, okay, women should always make the first move, yaar. There's no, that's dumb. then you'll never get any, let me say. So think of evolving consent.
No, women should also make the first move.
Women should also make the first move, not always. Men should make the move when they feel confident, comfortable, not because they are guys. But consent has to be evolved together. It can't be done one way without equality.
The question is kind of like, why does the burden lie on the consent seeker? If the consent seeker is the one seeking sex, then obviously the burden lies on the consent seeker. So, whoever it is, it's a guy or a girl, depends. So, depends what you want to do. And evolving consent is an excellent way to put it, actually, because you are evolving it at every given point. Okay, you and I did this together, maybe we should try that together. And then wait for the other person to make the next suggestion at least, that if the person likes you, then the person will say something. Okay.
I asked my class to come and sit in the audience, and I think they are getting their revenge by asking me a lot of questions. The first question is, what is the difference between against her will and without her consent? Okay? Against her will and without her consent. I can't answer that for you. Each one of us has to be able to answer that question. You cannot have a meaningful relationship with another person if your lines of communication are not open. So if you are having a doubt that you don't really know whether I'm doing something against her will or his will, or against her consent or his consent, and I'm making it both ways, so it's not only that you need to seek women's consent only, it's a mutual relationship. And mutual relationship requires mutual request. And the answer will not come from the outside, it will have to come from each one of us. So to say that there can be a definition of when it is against her will or that's different from seeking consent, I think you are thinking like a positivist lawyer, and I don't subscribe to that philosophy. So think about it very carefully. It's not I'm not making light of it. What I'm saying is that standards of behavior, standards of conduct have to be the ones that we make for ourselves. As Paramita said, that it is old-fashioned, but it is true that we would like to be treated the way, we should treat other people the way we would like to be treated. And I think there cannot be much confusion in that as to when you know the other person is a willing partner or not. Another question is, with the idea of code of conduct to be made by us and to internalize it, if two people engage in sex consensually and later there are some fallouts of that activity, how each one of them will be held responsible, how will the code of conduct be enforced? Not everyone can be told about such private matters, and how to bring public force to it. Can I suggest that if we think about our current laws to do with sexual assault, so there is a standard of behavior that is encoded in those laws. Now you can replace that standard of behavior by another standard of behavior. You could say that maybe if enough of us talk about it openly and if the stigma doesn't attach to it, that maybe we will come up with some kind of somewhat, not universal, but we are willing to go along that is our current standard, societal standard. Maybe, maybe not. But could we make the law like that? That is now our current change standard of behavior? We probably can. Will that solve everything for us? I don't think so. So the point that I'm making is that law is only there as a very rough guide. We are dealing with very intimate emotions, very intimate relationships, And law has a role to play, but in our everyday interactions, do not look for the crutch of the public code of conduct. It has to be that each one of us feel responsible for our behavior. Each one of us feel that we have it in us that we will treat the other person with respect and in return want to be treated with respect. So some of the things that I'm hearing on the grapevine around the campus is the very insulting words that are used for your sexual partners, that basically belittling them and kind of playing upon the fact that if somebody doesn't have a sexual partner, then somehow they are not popular, they haven't arrived, they're not really the happening thing of our times. If you are doing that, think very carefully. What you're saying to your sexual partner in private, will you have the confidence to say that in public? Anything that cannot be said in public should not be said in private. Secondly, if such demeaning things are being said to you, why do you want to put up with it? Your self-respect, to a very large extent, is in your hands. Anyone who demeans you, whether in a sexual context or in any other context, you have to stand up for it. You can't go to the law, you can't go to your teachers, you can't go to your institution saying, so-and-so insulted me, so-and-so demeaned me, so-and-so belittled me. You are empowered people. If you can't stand up for yourselves, what do you think the rest of the society will be doing? You're going to run tomorrow's courts and corporations and legislatures and the rest of it. If you don't start taking responsibility for yourselves, how will you take responsibility for others? So the point I'm trying to make is that what I was getting at is that all of us are basically have to face up to it, that we are responsible for our conduct. And if I am demeaning somebody, I should face up to it. If somebody is demeaning me, I should be able to stand up and say, sorry, nothing is worth it. I may be the most ostracized person in my group, but I will not put up with being demeaned. What stops me from doing that? So that's what I'm getting at, that no amount of external standards will help us achieve that. There's another question which says, if time is left after student questions, so maybe I'll give it to somebody else and then maybe we'll come back.
Thank you, Archana. Yeah, both these questions are, it's really interesting because they both have 3 points each, which, yes, I just mean it's interesting how the question is set out, A, B, C, worth 10 marks each. I wonder where you're getting it from. Anyway, just trying to mimic the lecturers, I guess. Yes, move on. Both of them, isn't it interesting? Anyway, they both ask about consent, and they ask a pretty, reasonable question. So the first one asks, what acts warrant consent? How do you ask for it? Especially in an area where expressing everything may lead to things becoming awkward or undesirable, and can people withdraw consent later? And the other also gets to that point. I'm bothered about the question that consent can never be free. Is it not always affected by our surroundings or circumstances? Some opinion formed by us because of someone's influence usually affects our consent. Because you're lawyers, I'll just quote this little example of contract law. If you remember all those old debates on contract law and how did contract law originate? Apparently the signing of the contract, there had to be a symbolic gesture. And the way you've consented to the contract, all those elements are present, is when you actually blow out the candle. apparently there was a flourish of blowing out of the candle. So that was during, I suppose, the 17th and 18th century. Things changed and it became the seal, if you remember. That was a super, super important contract. But everybody found that a bit bothersome, and that changed. Then it was the handshake. But now we don't even speak to each other. We have e-signatures. So the handshake's gone. So what I'm trying to say is it really depends on circumstances, I agree. But that is consent. As Archana and as the other speakers stated, India is going through a huge change. Social moral, the values held by parents are most probably clashing with those of younger generations, of people in universities. I can look back at the university where I work in and a lot of people that I know around your age, and they usually enter into a sexual relationship after alcohol. That is the circumstance in which they enter into a sexual relationship. Alcohol is not the guilty party. Alcohol merely opens the door to perhaps expressing things that they feel otherwise pressured to not express. Alcohol is not the thing that's at fault. I know Nell says an alcohol-free zone, so I won't go there. But I was just trying to state that it really depends on the circumstances. So of course consent is determined by the circumstances you're in, the group you're with. If the group you're with believes in a different set of values, that you can have one partner for a month and proceed to another, well, that is what you're going to be voicing. If the group recommends somebody and you take on that view, of course you're going to be influenced by that. But it comes back to you. What you think afterwards. Are you happy you had that 5th drink? Will you do it again? Are you happy you took that person's advice and ended up with somebody? Will you do it again? So consent is supposed to be a meeting of minds, if you remember, in contract law. But behaviorally speaking, consent is also about acknowledging that there mightn't be this meeting of minds and you won't do it again. So circumstances, definitely, they will, as contract law has proceeded to e-signature, definitely shape consent. Circumstances, social codes, friends' values, all shape consent. But in the end, you're the one who's going to be giving that consent, and you're the one who's going to be deciding whether what you did is an honorable thing or not. So it does shape consent, but can you say yes to somebody who is making an advance? Of course you can. The touch, the look, the flick of the hair. I mean, I'm just talking as a very old woman. You all know that. You all know how to send messages out. Sometimes you send the wrong message. Then you go back and correct that, don't you? Just like any good lawyer would. Bit of whiting out and do it again. But it's a matter of learning too. And you're at an age where learning should be something you do in a guilt-free zone and enjoy and not get into too much trouble.
Okay. So I think Paramita is sitting with some and Jugal is sitting with some. So I'll just kind of leave the mic.
Hello. Yeah. How do you address the power imbalance in relationship as it is relevant in the light of communication? In situation of confusion, is it really possible to have an honest communication? What amounts to honest communication? And then there's a logic diagram which says communication consent. Okay. Firstly, if there is confusion at any point in there, you don't, like, that itself implies that there is no consent if you're confused in any way. Let me go a little bit romantic on this, which is, and also maybe a little science, because sex is a drug. You have all sorts of hormones and other chemicals that release in your brain and the rest of your body, which get you a particular kind of high. That's why sex is enjoyable. And the one thing which I know from doing drugs is that don't do it if you're confused. You'll have a bad trip. So, yeah, when there is confusion, just assume that there is no consent. Try to clear it out with your friends or whoever you're trying to get intimate with or have sex with. And then once the confusion is cleared, I'm sure you'll have fun. What's the situation of implied consent, considering scenarios? Scenario 1 is being in a long-term relationship. Scenario 2, something as simple as holding hands. Scenario 1 should be pretty obvious, because if you're in a long-term relationship and let's assume that there is no conversation and two of you just decide to go at it, and you realize that your partner is not into it and you don't feel it, then there's something wrong with your relationship at that point, and that should be the biggest sign. And one of you does need to step up at that point, saying, dude, I don't want this. The other one is something as simple as holding hands. Well, if you're holding hands and they get clammy, then just unhold them. How do you talk about sexual assault within a friend circle or within a family? Actually, this should be rephrased, because I don't think the problem should be how do you talk. You should be talking to your friends and your family if you're going through any of this. It should be how do you listen, because at this time you should just listen. If somebody is going to talk to you about sexual assault, like their own story or somebody else's, then at this point you just need to sit down and listen. That's all you can do. Let me give you one example from the recent past, which is an example from an industry where people don't really talk about, I'm sure I'm just talking about the porn industry. So recently there was a case where a porn star accused her ex-boyfriend of raping, who's also a porn star, of raping her while they were actually having sex. And they were into the rough, kinky sex scene. And she said that I kept using my safe word. So if you're aware of any of the kink and the BDSM scene, then there's something called a safe word. A safe word is when if a partner uses a safe word, the other one just needs to stop. This revelation on Twitter from the ex-girlfriend, from the girlfriend, okay, I'll just name them because they're all out in the open. So Stoya was the porn star who accused her boyfriend, ex-boyfriend James Dean, D-E-E-N, of raping her. And at which point the entire porn industry went quite nuts. There were a lot of other porn stars, women who came out and said that, yes, this happened to us as well, with the same guy. At which point, there was one of the porn stars who did not have a problem with James Dean at all. She said, no, maybe some of these women are not into whatever. But her name's Asa Akira, and she immediately followed that up with, this is where I learned my lessons from. She immediately came out and said that, but if a woman is saying that I was sexually assaulted, there's no way that you don't take her seriously, no matter what her background is or where she's coming from. So, be it a man or a woman, if anybody's about to tell you something, tell you about their sexual assault, be it your family, be it your friends, just sit down and listen. It's not going to take a lot.
Two different questions here. One is, shouldn't consent be consent in my opinion is allowing people to get close to you physically in a way which may make the person who gives such consent feel comfortable. Consent is required in most cases of physical proximity, like you may not like being tickled, so people should take your consent. One of the things that bothers me most is that a lot of times when I'm touched by someone, it may be something as simple as holding hands, and if I raise the issue of it not being comfortable, I'm considered uptight and very conservative. I think that this is a very common and important experience, that if somebody says that they're not comfortable with something, they're immediately branded uptight or a prude. And in those circumstances, I think you can do two things. You can tell the person, it is not that I am uptight or a prude, I just do not want this particular physical contact from you. And you should walk away from that person, because you're being coerced into doing something that you said you didn't want to do. And that's very simple. Telling somebody, if you don't want to go bungee jumping and people call you a coward, you will not go bungee jumping, right? And people will keep calling you a coward and you will still not go. So similarly, yes, if somebody calls you a prude or says you're conservative and that's something you feel is not true about you, You can't change the fact that they're doing it, but what's important is for you not to give in to the pressure that because I'm calling you this and this is in social circumstances a bad thing, you must now give in to me in order to prove that you are liberal. Because you don't have to prove anything to anybody except to yourself, and that way if you want to, right? So I'll just raise a separate issue which is not addressed in this. Now, supposing you are a prude, what then? Is it bad to be a prude? It's a difficult question. I don't know the answer to it, but it's a question you can only ask yourself. Nobody else can tell you, right? Yes? I hate it. It is, of course. And the thing is that, as you are saying correctly, that what should we base consent on? Is it based on prior experiences of doing the same thing? Now, frankly, if you've done it 2 or 3 times and the person has said like, dude, I really don't like this, and you keep doing it, then you're being non-consensual. I mean, that's not confusing. So you are basically assaulting somebody within a long-term relationship, and the person in that relationship needs to call that person out and put a distance between them and the other person till they are willing to change their ways, or whatever it is that the person who feels they are being oppressed is asking. I think that I also do feel that, and it's my personal opinion, so I don't know that it holds anything, but in a long-term relationship, many things are negotiated, and sometimes boundaries are crossed. And that is something that you negotiate bit by bit. Mistakes can be made. And if we expect ourselves and other people to be politically perfect beings, then, happy waiting. But so the thing is that we bring that judgment to a situation thinking what is nicest, kindest to others and to ourselves, taking many things into account. So if it happens the first time and somebody doesn't like it and they say, don't do that, a person should ideally stop. So perhaps they don't. And then that's something to be tackled and say that please, when I ask you not to do something, you really must not do it. But it may not become a matter of like extremeness if that's not the pattern of the relationship, right? So I do think that in long-term relationships, what we look at are patterns, with the exception of extreme behaviors, right? So and if patterns exist which are not fair, either from one side or the other, because you may become aware of a pattern on your part which is oppressive. The onus is not only on the oppressed party to call out the oppression, but sometimes it's worth asking ourselves if we are always coercing. See, I'm a very persuasive person, for example. So it's very possible that I often persuade people to do what I want them to do, right? So at some point I have to become cognizant of that. Like, am I unfairly using my persuasive powers to make people who are not so vocal or so confident do the thing that I want to do? And conversely, there are times when people go along with things they're not dying to do out of love or acceptance. So I don't think we can polarize our relationships into such strictly codified and sanitized things. There is an ongoing logic and narrative of a relationship and even of a sexual encounter in which things make sense, right? Okay, so the next question on this was, how do we get our parents on our side when we are out on when we are exploring our sexual selves and we might make some screw-ups? This is a very important and very difficult and unanswerable question. But at least all the sex educators that we've met and spoken to on Agents of Ishq say all parents need sex education as well. And I really do agree. Now, are you going to take on the onus of educating your parents? I think it's a neat idea. You can do it. So actually there is an article on Agents of Ishq which I would suggest you'll go and read. It's called Amma, It's Time We Had the Talk. And it is about, see, because in India we live with our families even when we are quite a bit older, right? So it's not like at 18 or 20 you move out of home. Now, so if you're 25 or 28 and living at home, are you going to continue pretending as all Indians pretend that you're a virgin? See, I'm 47, I can still pretend, right? So the thing is that she decided, this woman, that she didn't want to be in this false relationship, but she didn't really want to talk to her mom about the fact that she's sexually active. So she started sharing books with her mom that she was reading and discussing the sexual issues in the book, or like saying, I'm going to this movie, why don't you come with me, which would have a little bit more sexual content, so that at least talking about sex as a first step became easier between parent and child. I thought this was quite a good solution, and so slowly she is comfortable with her mom, and maybe if something happens she can turn to her mom. And this is written by a woman in her 20s, so I feel yes, we do need to look at that. About the mess ups, I just want to say one thing. So supposing the mess up you're talking about is an abortion. Supposing you have sex and you get pregnant, or your partner gets pregnant, and you deal with it in this way. Some people's parents may be on their side, some people's parents may not be able to be on their side. This is a tough one. That's why I say make friends, because friends are on your side always. Even when you've done the wrong thing, you need some people. If you've done the wrong thing, doesn't mean nobody should help you, right? So the thing is, you got to do that. But the second thing is, if you make a mistake, that doesn't mean you're a horrible person. It doesn't mean you're a fool. It doesn't mean you're a loser. It doesn't mean you're a washout. It means you've made a mistake. It's a sexual mistake, right? So there are many mistakes we make. Among them are sexual mistakes. So like, move on from a sexual mistake. Don't use it as a way to make yourself into Devdas, right? And don't use it as a way to be like Paro and be pissed off with Devdas for your whole life either, right? So yeah, I think I hope that answers those two questions.
So just one small addition to the question previously asked. If somebody ever asks you, would I ever do that, you just stop, you just say home, bye-bye at that point.
Because you just did that, you said you just did it.
This is linked to the question that Paramita was responding to, that how do I tell my parents, or how do I start a conversation with them? And here is a question that I have that is basically saying that the sexual morality of our parents or of our wider society is very different than what we are talking about here. Now, what is the role of your institution in giving you this freedom and being answerable to other stakeholders like the high court judges and the legal establishment and the parents who are supporting the institution and supporting your education here? So there is a very big tension here. The fact that we are having this conversation, I think, is congratulations to your teachers, to your institution, and to you, that both of you have had the courage to face up to it, that just by pretending that nothing is happening, it will not go away. That your teachers and other people will have to answer to your parents? I don't think so. I think if I was an administrator and one of your parents came up to me and said, what are you doing? You're making my child immoral by allowing them to have sexual relationships. First of all, it cannot be policed. I mean, I can try, but I'm likely to fail. So, and should I be policing it? If you as a parent think that your child should not be exposed to any possibility of sexual encounters in a residential institution, then maybe you need to think carefully again that that is a role the institution will not be able to perform. The fact that this institution is openly acknowledging that this is what is happening it makes your administrator's role that much harder in trying to justify what we are doing. But would you have it any other way? I think we have to acknowledge that what we are doing, all of us, you and us, is basically that we are dealing with a subject that's a taboo subject. But dealing with a taboo subject by pretending that it is not happening is not going to work. So it is a difficult call. It has been taken. Who convinces your parents? I don't think it should be the role of the teachers. I think that's where you have to take ownership of your identity, your sexual agency, and find ways of opening the possibilities. It may not happen. Maybe your parents will throw you out. Are you ready for that? If you're not, then the call is still yours. You decide what do you want to do. Don't make it somebody else's responsibility. So that is, I think that has been the message throughout, that you are active agents of your own destiny, of your own identity. Take charge and don't be apologetic for it.
Take that one last. I handed it over to the panel. Any other questions? Anybody? Yeah.
I mean, not so much a question, but just to build on Professor Parashar's last point. So I've been a student in a similar school and now a lecturer here for some time, and it's a problem which is recurrent. Obviously, I think one of our students was also mentioning that, especially in long-term relationships, how do you even define abuse? If I were to kind of interpret your question the other way around. But I mean, coming back to that lens of a positivist lawyer, very often the direct criticism that we face, both internally and externally, is not so much that you couldn't prevent the assault from happening or you couldn't police the students. I don't think many people are saying that directly to us. But a direct sort of criticism tends to be that once you start investigating, why are you not following the norms of adversarial trial, so as to speak? Obviously, there is a nuance that most of us as insiders know, that we have this elaborate code against sexual harassment. It does try to confer more agency on the individual who might be affected. And largely, we try and respect those choices. But just as, I mean, I'm not personally involved in those processes here, but having known some of the parties involved in different institutions, it seems to be a point that we haven't done a good job of explaining. Almost invariably the argument is, but you never gave the accused a chance to explain themselves. So of course, if you start the conversation at the level that, look, it's not a criminal trial, don't kind of escalate it to that level, then invariably people start thinking that we are also being protective about our reputation. I mean, if I can say this openly, though some of us were not directly sort of involved in responding to to a recent instance, but this was this implicit criticism coming. And to be honest, I'm a bit conflicted as to how I should respond to someone who's outside the institutional framework. Because at the background, of course, we have this problem of many parents coming from parts of the country where an open discussion like this would not be encouraged. But just in terms of situating our response. Yeah, I'm just curious about what kind of discussions you've heard elsewhere or what you would want to add just on that last point.
You want me to?
Yeah, if possible. Yeah.
I haven't directly heard anything, but I was just responding to this question. And basically what I'm getting at is that if I was in your shoes, how would I respond? I would feel very put upon to be told by parents that you are responsible for my child's sexual morality. I think the parents should have done a better job for a start. But other than that, it's a more serious issue that you are adults. You are here to make a life for yourselves. You are making choices. Don't expect others to take the, if you like, the brunt of if it is not approved of conduct. Have the courage to stand up and say, like, this is what I want to do. It will cost you a lot. Well, if you're not willing to pay the cost, then don't engage in the conduct. The choice remains yours. But to say that the institution is the problem is sort of missing the point completely. That parents are the problem is also sort of shifting the blame. How long are you going to say that parents made me do it or they are the cause of whatever I am? You are here as adults. Take the ownership of your life, and I think all of you ought to feel quite lucky that you are in an institution in India where this discussion is happening.
Anybody wants to sort of raise any other freewheeling question which you feel? I think because in different ways the kinds of questions you had sent out to us have been addressed by the panelists. But from what the panelists have said, if anyone has a comment, a query, a concern. Okay, I suppose for the present, we have at least food for thought. So, Professor Mustafa, I have a question, not for you, but for the institution, which is saying that as an institution, if it is okay to have a conversation about the conventional issues of sex, why do we have gender segregation in hostels? What I would suggest to you is basically this, that if you see today's evening's proceedings and you see how they have panned out, it's not just about your body languages, becoming more comfortable, from people sitting ramrod straight to people laughing to people sort of loosening up and saying it's okay because it's a conversation around sexual consent. It doesn't mean we're doing anything here. It's like that kind of general relaxation one found. It's also to do with the fact of, and I'm not saying just about you, I'm saying as much on the panel, you do not know. I think all of us have prepared for this panel 4 times more than what we do for any class. So it's not, the anxieties were at several levels because we're not used to making that conversation. So what my suggestion somewhere would be, and is that possibly this could be our next conversation. It's another way of looking at issues about the fact of why we are not comfortable or comfortable with. Can we think in terms of one hostel going other way? Can we not can we talk in terms of maybe just visitation hours? Can we speak in terms, can we? Or are we not comfortable with it, or it's not ready for, we just want to discuss it, we don't want to do anything. Because if you want to do something, you first of all have to start to talk about it. You can't possibly do anything without that talking. And I think one of the things all the panelists have said in different kinds of ways is just this, that large parts of our problems are coming from the fact that, we can't talk about sex, it's against our culture. It's like we're the second populous country in the world, but it's against our culture, they just come like that. So people will tell you about Kama Sutra, and people will tell you about a whole range of other things which are supposed to be India's contribution to the whole business of sexual interaction. But most importantly, and that's what I want you to, let's not think about the entire sexual contact and communication as only the sexual act. There is a range of things which happen, and the sensuality and romance happen with each of them. It's like when you go out for that movie, when you have, when you keep that seat next to you in the classroom and in the mess. And when you decide that, okay, with this particular teacher, we can't sit next to each other, so need to sit separately. All of this is part of that one kind of a romance that you are doing, a kind of a communication and a meeting of minds which is happening. In that, to be sort of saying what you're comfortable and not comfortable with, what gives pleasure and what doesn't. The reason why we're also very clear to say that understanding how to say yes. And we're deliberately putting that stress on the yeses, because till you learn to say yes, your no is not going to be taken seriously. See, otherwise, the sort of, I don't even know whether it's a patriarchal spiel or what. It's this business of that whole nonsense of saying that, all right, if she's saying no, it means maybe. And if she's saying maybe, it means yes. And if she's saying yes, she's not a woman at all, because she can't possibly say yes. And that's the myth we are throwing out. You're saying very much, I can say yes, and because I can say yes, when I say no, it is no. And it's that conversation that we need to have, because it becomes easier for everybody. It's amongst a series of jokes which are doing in the net. One of the things is like, okay, there's a set of jokes about like how men think. And it's a joke, so I want you to take it in just that manner, but I still feel there's a point there. It's saying, don't sort of imply to us, don't give us broad hints, don't do this, that, and the other, just tell us I can do this or I can't do that. That's the only thing I understand. It's a way of, it's a kind of communication, and I'm saying in a similar sort of a manner that nobody is saying. I think Anandita, when she went around at least the first year, second year sections, she said, are we never going to have a song like Aankhon Mein Ishara Ho Gaya? That is, it's like, is it, if all of consent is going to be that kind of thing, are we throwing that? What we're trying to somewhere saying is we need to develop sensitivities. We need to be listening to each other when we are talking and when we are not talking. I'm talking to you about your body language. I'm talking to you about the fact of the sort of relaxation which came into the room. The kinds of issues very evidently when Paramita made her presentation got addressed. The kind of concerns. The panelists spoke, you could say, okay, this, different people at different points of time, the penny dropped. And it's all non-verbal. You're not standing up and saying, Hanji, ab samajh mein aa gaya. Nobody is doing that. It's like, but it works. And it's about those kind of sensitivities. So it's a agenda of do's. Let's work on that. We know the don'ts. The don'ts is about criminal law. The don'ts is about the whole area of regulation, and I'm not saying it's not important, but I don't think we have human relationships with a regulator telling us when it is okay to say hello and when it's not. Nobody tells us when you should be saying sorry and how you should be saying thank you. How do you say the pleases? How do you be charming? How are you? I mean, like, reams of poetry people memorize as a way of wooing people, as a way of getting other people to sort of say, yes, I care. And it's that caring that one needs to cultivate. I think that's the heart of consent. This respect for each other, and it could be either way. It doesn't matter who's making the play. You like a person, you ask the person. Person says no, okay. There would typically all be, there are lots of other, what is it? I don't know, I've forgotten the formulation. I'm getting old, no, I'm forgetting that one. And okay, there are other options available. And we don't like everybody. We don't make friends with everybody. So why is it that if you want to have sex with somebody and the other person doesn't want to have it with you, so what big deal? Yeah, there are other people who may want to have it, and that's the point which Paramita is making. Be venturesome, but be respectful in that venture. You float that company. If nobody wants to buy the shares, maybe, another kind can be floated. It's a change your, whatever, share capital, say, proprietary bana lo, partnership kon lo, company nahi banti hai. We can think about it in several sorts of ways. I'm only sort of saying to you, at the end of the day, to have happy relationships, to have respectful relationships, is to be happy in life. If a relationship is making you unhappy, it's all wrong. Consent, not consent. I mean, people consent to give away their fundamental rights, so we are told it's not the right thing to do, but still, it's a similar kind of thing. So, chill maro, be happy. Yes, dear?
So, in light of what institutional context or anything on those lines, ironically, relationships are seen to be unproductive, all right? So, which means that if we say we had the proctoral board here, they wouldn't agree with saying, they wouldn't agree with you being, okay,
and your proctor has sent her apologies and has promised to sort of look at these tapes because she fell ill. I mean, she was one person who was meant to be here. Anyway, carry on.
Right,
yeah, go on.
What I'm trying to say is, therefore, when you need to sit away from each other in a particular class, or say take it to a larger extent where you'll be looked at differently in a restaurant if you go on a date and not with your parents or with the same gender group of people. My question is that how do you go about changing that, especially in the institutional context? I mean, you'd get a frown if you were sitting on that road there with a girl and not with a guy, right? So
I'm not sure.
But
I think we have orientations more than one.
Right, but I'm just saying, so for instance, how in the institutional context would we ever be able to change that if the focus of the institution is always, say, academic excellence?
Okay, yeah, I'll answer him. You wanted to say something, I'll sort of come in there.
Okay. I don't think it's about the proctoral board. It might be about the person that, it might be person specific. But coming back to the question of the cohabitation, which the last question was about, I think before these guys came in, the first and the second years, we had a consultation which was largely driven by parts of the present day proctoral board. So could be, because you've already said maybe it's a good next conversation to have. So before we have that conversation, could we actually have some sort of an online form to sort of understand as to what number of students would be happy to move into a cohabitation, or what number of students would be happy to move into a visitation system? Because previously what happened, it happened from the students' end, and from a recent conversation what I gagged onto the fact was that it didn't really percolate across to us when we were really interested in sort of supporting one idea or the other. Right,
okay.
So could we have that, please?
All right. I mean, I would just give, I have two separate responses to give. Jagdishwar, my response, and from a very people participative manner, I would sort of want to have the discussion first and the online form later. I'd want people to make an informed choice, and if you take the voting first, then what tends to happen is that whatever is your fuzzy idea of what's going to be happening, everybody goes and tells you, you know what, if they're going to have this, then from tomorrow onwards, we can't move in the men's hostel with just banyan and underwear, out. So everybody votes against it for that reason. See, what I'm trying to say is that we need to have, I'm with you on the vote part of it. I'm only saying, and that's the same thing one is saying here. I'm saying is, as law people, though not as judges, as law people, we expect that when we do some kind of a discussion, there has to be an outcome, there must be a judgment. I think we need to learn from our judges and reserve judgments more. You know, it's important. It's important to do that. So I would somewhere say, let's have the conversations first. And that's partly an answer to you. You're saying, how will the culture change? I can tell you when I joined this institution, and that's about 18, 19 years old, you have some of your 18, 19 years ago, and you've your alums here, you ask Vaibhav. You talk about policing. I'll tell you what it was like. I'll get you stories from alums. It's an important thing to see. The movement has come. Every one of the panelists, and I don't think that they were just being complimentary for its own sake. It's a fact that we are sitting down here and having this conversation not between students and not in some basement somewhere. It is a conversation we are having, which we are recording. And we're saying this is something we need to talk about. So cultures don't just change, cultures change with practice. Academic excellence, I'll just give you this as one major study that Harvard has done. It's a longitudinal kind of study which talks in terms of the one major factor which has contributed to people considering themselves successful at the end of their lives. before whatever. It's like if one common factor which was found, it was to have one steady, one happy relationship in your life. It is not what you became or which position you occupied. I think we are trying to inaugurate that process. It's saying, but you can't be happy in any relationship if only half the relationship is happy. Both have to be happy, and it's important that both should work at. Coming on the same page is not an easy exercise. One has to work at it. But then if you have to really strive hard to get the best corporate placement that you want, you have to work hard to have a rollicking relationship. It doesn't just happen. काम करना पड़ता है for everything. I end by thanking the various people who have, the panelists. Paramita, I'm really, really grateful. I know how very busy you are, and for you to find the time for it. She did a course with us on love, truth, and justice, and it was like, and again, the course came because of the sort of kind of conversation and the sort of work she's doing in Agents of Ishq is like hats off. I mean, I'm really one of her, like, committed fans. So, thank you so much, Jugal. I know it was like, I think somewhere, poor guy, he got the experience of what it's like to be one woman on a men's panel, but I mean, we are picking them up again on 13th night. So, if you are a Gyan scholar, you are under an obligation to give Gyan all the time. So very thankful to Anandita for putting this event together. And I'm extremely Professor Mustafa to sort of say, yeah, if this is the thing to be done, it will happen. Thank you so much.
I didn't think this was going to be like a formal thing, but if there is a vote of thanks, then I think we must thank Professor Dhanda for thinking of the whole thing in the first place.